In a packed federal courtroom, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood alone against the formidable might of The View, a show watched by millions. Sued for public defamation and televised retaliation, the program had crossed a line, and Jasmine was determined to draw it back. Armed with damning evidence, she didn't just challenge a narrative, she confronted a media empire. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a battleground where reputations were on trial and the very meaning of accountability was re-examined. The tension was palpable, the stakes unprecedented, and as the jury delivered its verdict, the world held its breath. And now, with the nation watching, only one question remains. What sentence will history deliver to The View? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It began like a controlled detonation, silent at first, but lethal by design. Just after dawn on a Monday morning, Jasmine Crockett's legal team strode into the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., armed not with cameras or headlines, but with something far more dangerous, a second lawsuit, this time sharpened to cut through media armor. The papers were thick, 127 pages of meticulously compiled evidence, time-stamped clips, internal memos, and damning off-air audio recordings. Filed with the precision of a scalpel and the force of a wrecking ball, the suit alleged retaliatory defamation, willful malice, and continued misconduct by The View's hosts, all while under active litigation. Within 2 hours of the filing, leaks began flooding through the industry like a cracked dam, one outlet calling it the most explosive lawsuit filed against a media giant in over a decade. By midday, ABC's top floor was in lockdown. Boardroom lights burned long past business hours as executives scrambled to contain what one insider bluntly described as a corporate hemorrhage. Jasmine's second strike wasn't just a legal move. It was a calculated assault on arrogance, and the shockwaves were immediate. Phone lines jammed. Sponsors, some of them worth 7 figures, pulled out with surgical speed, citing risk exposure and reputation misalignment. The mood at The View's studio turned funereal. Joy Behar reportedly stormed off set during a rehearsal, shouting that they let this girl weaponize the courts. Sunny Hostin, normally calm and polished, was seen pacing the hallways, frantically texting legal counsel. Whoopi Goldberg said nothing, not on air, not off, just silence, the kind that screams louder than any denial. Emergency meetings were called every 3 hours. The network's crisis protocol folder, something rarely touched, was now dog-eared and coffee-stained from overuse. And still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. Not a tweet, not a quote, no interview, only the lawsuit and the deadly calm of a woman who knew this time she wasn't just responding, she was retaliating with the weight of truth, and the law was on her side. And just when the smart move was silence, when the world was watching, when lawyers had issued internal memos begging for discretion, when advertisers were already slipping out the back door, The View made a catastrophic choice. They spoke, loudly, publicly, and with the kind of smug defiance that only comes from years of unchallenged power. The cameras rolled, the lights flared, and inside that glowing studio, 3 women seated at the table leaned not into reflection, but into fire. Joy Behar, eyes sharp with sarcasm, sat forward like a boxer before the bell and threw the first blow without blinking. She's just the mouthpiece of the radical left, a walking headline with no real depth. The words sliced across the air, and the audience, programmed for laughter, obliged. But this time, the laughter didn't land like humor. It landed like complicity. You could almost hear the collective gasp that never made it to air, the discomfort curling at the edges of the room like smoke no one wanted to acknowledge. Then came Sunny Hostin, her voice cooler but no less deliberate. She didn't just critique Jasmine Crockett, she stripped her of legitimacy. "This lawsuit," she said, gesturing dismissively, "it's not justice, it's a publicity tactic, another stage performance from the progressive media machine." The phrase was elegant in tone, venomous in meaning. Her words painted Jasmine not as a woman standing against a machine, but as the puppet of one, undermining the entire premise of the lawsuit with a single sentence. But it wasn't over. The final cut came from Whoopi Goldberg, who had been silent until then, fidgeting with her glasses. And then, without a trace of irony, she delivered what would become the most damning line of all. Let's be honest. She should be grateful we gave her a seat at this table. Otherwise, no one would even know who she is. Those words did not echo. They detonated. Not just in the studio, but across the legal battlefield Jasmine was quietly preparing. The arrogance was breathtaking. These were not offhand remarks. These were intentional provocations made on national television by individuals fully aware they were under legal scrutiny. It was not a misstep. It was a declaration of disdain, a public mockery of the very foundation of Jasmine's lawsuit. They weren't just daring her to respond, they were daring her to try and stop them. But what they didn't see, blinded by cameras, applause, and their own echo chamber, was that Jasmine Crockett had already stopped talking. She didn't need to clap back. She didn't need the last word. Because somewhere behind those courtroom doors, in silence and strategy, her evidence was being sharpened. And this time, it wasn't for attention. It was for blood. They thought it would disappear in the noise, that a few sarcastic comments, a smug laugh, and a little studio applause would fade away by nightfall. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't chasing attention. She was chasing accountability. And while the audience at home laughed, her legal team was already moving. The moment Whoopi Goldberg said, "Otherwise, no one would even know who she is," the clock started ticking again. In a private office in Washington, D.C., Jasmine's team kicked off a process they'd prepared for, collecting and preserving live evidence. No one needed to ask what to do. Everyone moved with purpose. One group downloaded the full studio broadcast, the raw, unedited version with time codes and separate audio channels. Another group began comparing the new footage to the original lawsuit. They were looking for one thing, proof that The View had not only ignored the lawsuit, but doubled down on attacking Jasmine. The audio was analyzed in extreme detail. Technicians listened carefully to background voices, laughter, even the tone in which each word was delivered. At the same time, the team compared those statements to emails ABC had already handed over during the first round of legal discovery. That's when they found it. An email from ABC's legal department warning the show's producers and hosts not to mention Jasmine Crockett or the case on air. That message was sent 2 days before the episode aired. It had been read, it had been acknowledged, and it had been ignored. That discovery changed everything. Why? Because in the eyes of the law, it's one thing to make a mistake. It's another thing entirely to know you're under legal scrutiny and keep attacking someone anyway. Jasmine's lawyers immediately began writing a new section of the lawsuit. This wasn't just about defamation anymore. It was now about retaliation, the deliberate targeting of someone already taking legal action with full awareness and intent. The team created a detailed chart. One column for each comment made by the hosts, one for the legal violation it represented, and another for similar past cases that set precedent. This wasn't opinion. This was strategy. Each line of dialogue from the show was being turned into a building block of a much bigger legal case. Joy Bihar's comment, calling Jasmine a mouthpiece for the radical left, was no longer just rude. It was now classified as an attempt to destroy reputation during litigation. Sunny Hostin's jab about the lawsuit being a publicity stunt was recorded as intentional undermining of legal credibility. And Whoopi's remark? It was seen as an effort to erase Jasmine's public worth, a classic sign of platform abuse. Legal experts didn't mince words. One media law professor, after reviewing the full segment, called it a textbook case of what not to do when you're being sued. Now, Jasmine's team wasn't just fighting a talk show segment. They were building a case to prove that The View, and by extension, ABC, had used their platform to intimidate and humiliate a legal opponent. They weren't commenting on the news. They were trying to control it. Jasmine had come to court for protection. They met her with mockery. And that wasn't just unjust. It was a direct violation of how media and power should operate in a democracy. She didn't shout back. She didn't take the bait. While headlines buzzed, Twitter exploded, and studio lights faded, Jasmine Crockett did exactly what they didn't expect. She remained silent. But her legal team didn't. They labeled every statement, cited every precedent, and wrote the new section of the complaint with unshakable calm. One paragraph read, "Defendants engaged in repeated and intentional attacks on the plaintiff, with clear knowledge of active litigation, in violation of legal norms, and with reckless disregard for the truth." The segment on The View lasted just 8 minutes, but in the courtroom, those 8 minutes would echo for years. And when the last piece of evidence was in place, when the audio had been dissected, the transcripts notarized, the broadcast footage cross-referenced down to the millisecond, Jasmine Crockett's legal team unleashed the storm. They didn't walk into court. They marched. The second lawsuit was filed in federal court at exactly 9:42 a.m., stamped and logged in a thick red folder labeled Escalated Action, High-Profile Defamation. It wasn't filed quietly. It wasn't strategic whispering. It was a legal declaration of war, 137 pages long, armed with new evidence, expert affidavits, in a tone that made it clear this was no longer about seeking apology. This was about demanding accountability. Attached were side-by-side timelines showing the first lawsuit's progression and the continued on-air attacks. There were quotes from retired judges stating that ABC's response wasn't just poor judgment, it was an act of institutional recklessness. And perhaps most chilling of all was the conclusion drawn by Jasmine's attorneys. The defendants, with knowledge of ongoing litigation, weaponized their platform to deliberately injure, belittle, and publicly retaliate against the plaintiff in violation of basic legal boundaries and professional ethics. The 3 central allegations laid out in the complaint were sharpened like surgical blades. First, continued public defamation, where The View's host persisted in misrepresenting Jasmine's character on national television, not once, but across multiple episodes, even after the first lawsuit was in full motion. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, and that distinction was crucial. Second, intentional distortion of public perception during litigation, a serious accusation in federal defamation law. Jasmine's legal team argued that the hosts knew exactly what they were doing, undermining her credibility while she was under court protection, effectively trying to discredit her case by ridiculing the plaintiff in real time. And third, severe damage to professional reputation, citing not only viewer reactions and online harassment, but also internal memos from political donors and committee chairs who had begun distancing themselves from her amid the media frenzy. The damage wasn't theoretical, it was measurable, documented, and, most importantly, avoidable had the defendants not chosen to escalate. To support these claims, the filing included expert testimony from communication scholars and media ethicists, some of whom had worked on major First Amendment cases. One scholar wrote, "The behavior of the defendants demonstrates a contempt for judicial process and a disturbing willingness to override ethical standards for the sake of performative outrage." A retired appellate judge submitted a sworn statement emphasizing how rare it was for a media defendant to so flagrantly disregard legal caution. But it was a quote from Professor Harold Vance, a senior faculty member in media law at Georgetown, that echoed most powerfully through legal circles. This isn't a legal defense, it's a collapse in judgment. At this point, the only question left is what Jasmine Crockett wants printed on the check. That quote made it into the national headlines within hours, and into the opening summary of the complaint itself. But beyond the paper, beneath the structure of clauses and citations, lay something deeper. Jasmine Crockett wasn't fighting for a retraction. She wasn't filing out of pettiness or ego. She was standing up to a media institution that had mocked her, minimized her, and dismissed her humanity on live television, all while she was exercising her right to legal recourse. This wasn't just about what was said. It was about how it was said, in unison, with laughter, with smugness, in front of a national audience trained to applaud. And when that kind of behavior comes from a platform with the reach of ABC, it doesn't just bruise reputations. It rewrites public perception. And that's what Jasmine was fighting to reclaim, not just her name, but the truth that name stood for. So the lawsuit didn't come as a whisper. It came as a reckoning, backed not by outrage, but by evidence. It didn't beg for fairness, it demanded justice. And by the time the complaint was delivered to ABC's general counsel, There was no denying what had just happened. The conversation had shifted. This was no longer a media feud. It was federal litigation at full velocity, with the potential not just to punish, but to set precedent. Certainly. Here's the rewritten version of the passage above with the same content, structure, and intensity, but in clearer, more accessible English, while keeping the cinematic drama and emotional depth fully intact. While Jasmine Crockett's second lawsuit was moving powerfully through federal court, packed with clear evidence and expert backing, something very different was happening inside ABC's headquarters. It was chaos, real, loud, and out of control. The moment the broadcast ended, the mood in the building shifted from nervous to explosive. In the control room, where producers usually worked in calm coordination, people were now yelling over each other in panic. One senior producer slammed a binder on the table so hard it cracked and shouted, "We warned them! That memo went out days ago! Why did they still go there?" No one answered, because everyone knew why. The host had ignored the legal warning and gone ahead anyway. Live on air, mocking Jasmine Crockett right in the middle of an active lawsuit. That warning memo, once private and confidential, was now spreading across the studio like wildfire. It had come from ABC's own legal department, marked urgent on-air risk. It clearly told the hosts of The View not to mention Jasmine Crockett at all, not her lawsuit, not her name, not even vague references. The memo even gave specific phrases to avoid. But instead of following it, the hosts had done the opposite. And now that document was leaked, shared in emails, whispered about in meetings, and shown around like a smoking gun. The problem wasn't just what they said, it was that they were told not to, and they did it anyway. That made it more than a mistake. That made it legally dangerous. Tension spread through the office like a virus. Associate producers, who usually cared about segment timing and lighting setups, were now quietly searching legal terms and asking, can we be held responsible for what they said? A floor manager, pale and shaking, was overheard saying, "This is no longer a media issue. This is real legal trouble." Senior staff locked themselves in meeting rooms. HR started getting emails from employees asking to review their contracts and severance packages. A junior team member was seen crying in the hallway after being told, "You'd better keep a record of everything. People will start looking for someone to blame." The next morning, the atmosphere on set was completely different. There was no laughter, no jokes in the dressing room, no small talk in the makeup chair. Just silence, cold, heavy, and full of fear. And through all of it, one name hung in the air like a shadow: Jasmine Crockett. She didn't say anything. She didn't post. She didn't even show up. But somehow her silence echoed through every hallway. They had tried to humiliate her on live television, and now she was the one in control. She had followed the law. She had stayed quiet. She had let the evidence speak for her. And now the ones who once mocked her were scrambling, unprotected and afraid. Upstairs in the boardrooms, ABC executives were holding emergency calls with lawyers across the country. Some were arguing, trying to save what was left. Others were already preparing for resignations. But the damage had already been done. The question wasn't, how do we fix this? It was, who takes the fall? And the worst part, they were warned. Jasmine didn't trap them. They walked into it themselves. And now the price was coming due. And as the atmosphere inside ABC shifted from panic to paralysis, the consequences of arrogance began cutting into the network's most vulnerable artery: money. Less than 24 hours after Jasmine Crockett's second lawsuit was filed in federal court, a chain reaction began, one not driven by opinion, but by numbers, contracts, and the cold logic of corporate self-preservation. The first warning sign came in the form of a terse email from a global automotive sponsor. Effective immediately, all ad placements related to The View are suspended. We do not align our brand with content currently involved in active defamation litigation. No phone call, no apology, just a clean, immediate break. Within the hour, 2 more major advertisers followed suit, both from the pharmaceutical industry, both citing reputational risk exposure and invoking early termination clauses buried deep in legal fine print. By sunset, the ad team had tallied the losses. More than $7 million in scheduled sponsorships wiped out in one day. The kind of losses that don't just hurt profit margins. They draw boardroom blood. But it didn't stop there. The real devastation hit in what didn't happen. The silence from partners who had been weeks away from launching full-scale campaigns with the show. ABC's year-long strategic rebranding initiative for The View, a glossy multi-channel marketing push designed to frame the show as the last bastion of fearless daytime journalism, was officially frozen. A team of over 30 people, including media consultants, creative directors, and digital advertisers, were told to stop all outbound work. Design assets were pulled from cloud servers. Scheduled podcast crossovers were quietly canceled. A $1.2 million partnership with a major tech sponsor that was set to launch the following week vanished overnight after a closed-door legal review. The campaign had included billboards, targeted social media roles, branded interviews, and even a segment feature on Good Morning America. Now, none of it would see the light of day. Internally, the message was chilling in its precision. An email marked URGENT:"internal" only circulated among the marketing and legal departments. It read, "All active and planned marketing related to The View is suspended until a full legal risk assessment is completed. This includes paid media, earned media, and co-branded promotions. Do not engage with talent or partners regarding status." The freeze wasn't just financial, it was symbolic. It said in plain terms that ABC no longer trusted its own product enough to promote it. For Jasmine Crockett, this was never about destruction. It was about accountability. But the ripple effect of her legal stand had turned into a tidal wave that struck ABC at its core. Not because she shouted, not because she staged a press war, but because she had the truth and she had the proof. And they, so sure of their invincibility, had handed her both. Live on national television. In a matter of hours, The View transformed from a money-making machine to a legal liability no one wanted to touch. Not advertisers, not sponsors, not even internal executives. The network's most powerful voices were now radioactive, not for what they believed, but for what they ignored. And in the quiet that followed, the most expensive sound of all was the one they could no longer afford: denial. But financial collapse was only the beginning. The reckoning was still to come, and it would unfold not in boardrooms or behind studio walls, but in a federal courtroom where cameras were barred, but history was watching. In that room, spin would be meaningless. In that room, power would not speak louder than truth. It would be tested by it. After weeks of tense standoffs, secret negotiations, and failed settlements, the case of Crockett versus American Broadcasting Companies, Inc. was officially called to trial. By dawn, the courthouse was surrounded. Reporters jostled for space outside security barricades. Legal analysts camped in folding chairs. Camera crews fed live updates to every major news network in the country. The crowd wasn't just large, it was electric. Hundreds stood in line for a seat inside, knowing they wouldn't just be watching a trial, they would be witnessing a moment of reckoning in American media history. And then, when the doors opened and the bailiff called her name, Jasmine Crockett stepped in, with no words, no expression, and no need to explain her presence. She wore a plain navy suit, no stylist, no press agent, just her legal team, walking beside her with locked jaws and a black-wheeled case so tightly sealed it might as well have held state secrets. Within ABC's own legal files, it had already earned a name whispered with dread: the kill file. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thinner, like pressure was building invisibly. The judge's gavel had barely dropped when Jasmine's lead attorney, a former federal prosecutor known for his restraint and ruthlessness, stepped forward and cued the first exhibit. The screens flared to life. The silence broke. And what followed was a precise, devastating unraveling of a media machine that thought it was untouchable. First came the raw video, crisp, slow-motion playback of the show's most explosive moments. Joy Behar scoffing as she called Jasmine a radical puppet, Sunny Hostin smirking as she dismissed the lawsuit as a PR stunt, and Whoopi Goldberg leaning forward, adjusting her glasses, and delivering the infamous line, "She should be lucky we ever put her on." The clips weren't shown for shock value. They were synchronized with timestamps, legal filings, and network production notes. Everything was documented, verified, weaponized. Then came the real crack in the armor. A projected internal ABC memo marked strictly confidential and dated 2 weeks before the episode aired. In plain language, it read, "Hosts are advised to avoid any mention of Representative Jasmine Crockett or related legal actions until reviewed by counsel. This is not optional." No one in the room moved. Some scribbled. Most just stared. But the prosecution wasn't finished. Screens shifted again, this time revealing email chains between producers and hosts. One message stood out, sent from an associate producer to an unnamed talent. "You sure you want to go there? Legal already flagged this. Talking about Crockett could get ugly." The reply came 2 minutes later. It was curt, arrogant. "We'll handle it. The audience eats this up." And then came the moment that turned the trial from serious to seismic. Jasmine's attorney pressed play on a short audio clip, a hot mic feed not meant for broadcast, a private comment recorded off-camera inside the View studio just minutes before the show went live. It wasn't edited, it wasn't dramatized, it was real, and it was damning. The voice was calm, familiar, authoritative. It was unmistakably Whoopi Goldberg. "Let it blow. We spin better than that little girl ever could." For nearly 10 seconds after the audio ended, the courtroom remained frozen. No rustling, no murmuring. Just silence so thick it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Judges leaned back in their chairs. Reporters stopped typing mid-sentence. The gallery, packed with lawyers, politicians, and journalists, sat stunned, not just by the words but by the brutal clarity of what they revealed. This wasn't miscommunication. This was premeditated retaliation, captured by their own microphones, wrapped in their own arrogance. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She sat as she had entered, quiet, focused, immovable. Because this wasn't about theater. It was about truth dressed in evidence. And now that truth had been unleashed in full view of the court, what had once been dismissed as a political stunt was now unfolding as a structured, deliberate assault on a woman who dared to hold power accountable, not just in her words, but in her silence. And as the weight of Jasmine Crockett's evidence settled over the courtroom like a loaded sky, the defense finally made their move, not with denial, but with misdirection. ABC's legal counsel stood, straightening his jacket like a man preparing for a stage, and delivered the argument they had been rehearsing for weeks. Calm, polished, persuasive, he tried to reframe the entire case as a misunderstanding of intent. "This show," he began, voice steady and practiced, "is entertainment. Its very purpose is to provoke dialogue, to challenge, to satirize. The View is not a courtroom. It is not a political weapon. It's a panel of opinionated voices doing what they've always done, engaging in cultural commentary." Then he pivoted toward Jasmine Crockett without ever saying her name directly. Yes, the plaintiff is a public figure, and with that role comes responsibility, comes scrutiny, comes criticism, sometimes harsh, but that is the price of visibility in a democracy. The First Amendment protects exactly this kind of speech. There was a stillness in the room, not from agreement, but from discomfort. The argument wasn't new. It was the same shield powerful media entities had used for decades. We weren't attacking, we were entertaining. But this time, it didn't land clean. Jasmine's attorney stepped forward, not with fire, but with force. His rebuttal began not with outrage, but with law. "We are not here to debate the value of free speech," he said. "We are here because my client was deliberately ridiculed by a media institution that knew it was under legal scrutiny, that received internal warnings to stop, and still chose to escalate. That's not protected speech. That's premeditated retaliation." Then he opened a leather-bound folder and began reading case law. New York Times Covey Sullivan, Hustler Magazine versus Falwell, Gertz v. Welch. One by one, he traced the line where opinion ends and defamation begins. The moment your words are framed as truth, the moment you knowingly lie, the moment you seek to destroy someone's public trust, not by disagreement, but by humiliation, you've crossed into illegality. The defense tried to shift again, insisting the statements were jokes, that no serious viewer would take them as literal. But Jasmine's team countered with viewer analytics, polling data, and real-world impact. They showed how online harassment against her spiked after each broadcast, how misinformation spread from that very episode had been quoted in political forums and blogs. These weren't just jokes, her lawyer continued. They were signals. They were instructions. And they were delivered by voices that carry institutional weight. But it was what came next that pierced the room like ice. The prosecution called to the stand Dr. Marshall Klein, one of the most respected media ethics scholars in the country. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words cut because they were quiet, measured, undeniable. I've consulted on over 40 cases of media ethics disputes, Dr. Klein began, looking directly at the jury. And in those, I've seen arrogance. I've seen carelessness. But rarely have I seen this level of institutional defiance. A network informed of legal risk, explicitly warned, and yet choosing to proceed, not despite those warnings, but because of them. He paused, then delivered the blow. If The View is not held accountable here, then we are not just failing Jasmine Crockett. We are telling every network in America that the law is a suggestion, not a boundary. That humiliation is entertainment. That bullying becomes comedy if filmed in front of a studio audience. The room fell silent again, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. The defense's argument, once so confident, now sounded like a leftover excuse from another era. Jasmine Crockett had not sued over discomfort. She had sued over deliberate harm, inflicted by people who knew better and who chose to act anyway. And now, for the first time in the trial, it was no longer just a legal battle. It was a moral line, and the court had to decide which side it stood on. And after 48 hours of unrelenting courtroom intensity, hours filled with piercing testimony, irrefutable evidence, and the unraveling of media arrogance disguised as satire, the jury vanished into deliberation, and the world held its breath. They had seen everything. The high-definition playback of mockery, the internal memos ignored, the hot mic recording that left no doubt about intent. For 2 full days, the courtroom had been a battlefield of truth and evasion. But when the door closed behind the 12 jurors, their decision came not with hesitation, but with clarity. Just 3 hours later, they returned. Not a single juror looked confused. Their expressions were calm, resolute. The room braced as the judge re-entered, his robe whispering over marble floors, his face composed but heavy with finality. The gallery fell silent. No murmurs, no coughs, no movement. Everyone knew the weight of what was about to be said. The judge opened the file, adjusted his glasses, and with the authority of someone who'd spent decades separating noise from justice, began. In the case of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett versus American Broadcasting Companies Incorporated, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. A ripple of gasps moved through the audience. A few heads turned toward ABC's table, but the judge wasn't finished. His voice never wavered as he delivered the consequences line by line, each word carving itself into the silence like a chisel through stone. The defendants, The View and ABC, are ordered to pay $1 million in damages for sustained acts of public defamation and retaliatory misconduct. Then came the second blow. ABC shall deliver a formal televised apology to air during national prime time within 72 hours using language approved by the court. And then, the verdict that no one in the studio had believed possible. Per recommendation from ABC's Internal Ethics Board, and in light of evidence of willful, repeated misconduct, Ms. Whoopi Goldberg, Ms. Joy Behar, and Ms. Sunny Hostin are to be immediately removed from their positions on The View. The silence shattered. It wasn't shouting or outrage. It was the quiet implosion of power, the sound of careers ending in real time. One of ABC's attorneys reached for a water glass and missed. A junior paralegal dropped her pen and didn't pick it up. Whoopi Goldberg, once the centerpiece of the show, sat utterly still. Joy Behar turned her head toward the floor and didn't look back up. Sunny Hostin exhaled, long and slow, like someone realizing she had crossed a line she could never return from. No one spoke. No one protested. There was nothing left to say. Every defense they had offered, it was just satire. She's a public figure. it was only commentary, had been stripped of meaning under the weight of sworn testimony, federal precedent, and their own recordings. And across from them, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She did not smile. She did not rise in triumph. She remained seated, posture steady, hands resting calmly in her lap. She had never raised her voice. She had never needed to. Because while the world underestimated her resolve, while seasoned media veterans tried to make her a punchline, she built her case like a fortress, brick by brick, fact by fact, until the truth stood taller than all of them. And now the verdict was not just a legal victory, it was a reckoning, a declaration that in a world so eager to weaponize words, truth still has a cost, and sometimes it gets paid in full. And as the final ruling echoed through the marble walls of the courthouse, the aftermath didn't roll in quietly, it erupted. What had begun as a courtroom drama became an international media phenomenon within hours. Newsrooms scrambled, headlines lit up, phones rang nonstop in editorial departments across every major network. Jasmine Crockett's name wasn't just trending, it was dominating every platform, every hour, every demographic. The Wall Street Journal ran a full-page feature above the fold with a headline that needed no decoration: Jasmine Crockett, the woman who brought a media empire to its knees. Cable news anchors who once dismissed the case as another flashpoint in America's outrage cycle were now reading prepared statements with visible astonishment. MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, each with their own political angle, each forced to confront the same undeniable fact: Jasmine Crockett had won, decisively, legally, and symbolically. Within 12 hours, ABC's court-mandated apology aired nationwide. It was stark, no graphics, no music, just a cold, static camera on a senior executive reading from a legal script approved by the judge. We at ABC and The View apologize unreservedly to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett for statements made that did not meet the standards of integrity, respect, or truth. That 60-second broadcast, aired simultaneously across ABC's primetime slots, was clipped, reposted, and dissected in real time. Within 12 hours, the video had over 30 million views across YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. Reactions ranged from stunned silence to standing ovations. On Twitter, one user wrote, "That wasn't an apology. That was a corporate surrender under court order." The internet, for once, was united, not by outrage, but by awe. Social media became a living monument to the trial. On TikTok, creators stitched together courtroom footage with clips from The View, drawing brutal side-by-side comparisons. A viral edit showed Jasmine sitting silently as Whoopi delivered the infamous "she should be grateful" line, then cut straight to the moment the judge announced her termination. Twitter users resurrected the hashtag Crockett Strikes Back, but this time it wasn't a protest, it was a celebration. Political commentators from both sides of the aisle weighed in, not just on the legal implications, but the cultural impact. One thread, retweeted over 90,000 times, read, "This wasn't a lawsuit. This was a mirror held to an industry that forgot truth has limits." She didn't yell. She didn't crack. She just documented and delivered. Jasmine Crockett, once mocked as just another politician chasing the spotlight, had become something entirely different, a symbol of restraint, weaponized by precision. In the days that followed, praise poured in from unexpected corners. Constitutional law scholars hailed the trial as a landmark. Journalists who had built careers inside the very media circles Jasmine challenged were now forced to reckon with the case as precedent. One Pulitzer-winning editor wrote in The Atlantic, "This was a siren in the dark, a warning shot to every talk show, podcast, and pundit panel that thought legal risk could be laughed away." Entertainment law firms issued memos to their clients. Training sessions were restructured. Suddenly, defamation under active litigation became a phrase discussed seriously in corporate boardrooms, not just legal textbooks. Networks across the country quietly began auditing their own content, rewatching past episodes, flagging any segment that even resembled what had happened on The View. Jasmine's victory hadn't just set an example. It had set a new legal and cultural standard. But Jasmine herself remained silent. No victory laps, no press tour, no celebratory roundtables, no media circuit she could have rightfully dominated. While journalists begged for quotes and producers offered exclusive interviews, she declined all requests. She didn't take the microphone. She didn't need to. The morning after the verdict, with the world buzzing, she simply posted a single sentence to her social media accounts. Just 12 words. "You don't have to shout. The truth is loud enough on its own." That line, calm, sharp, and utterly final, was screenshotted millions of times. It was printed on posters. It was turned into T-shirts. Some began calling it the new anthem of accountability. Others called it the beginning of a political reawakening, where power wasn't measured by volume, but by evidence and poise. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine's name continued to rise, not as a headline, but as a reference point. Universities began studying the case. Law schools added it to syllabi. Media professors used it to teach where ethics must override ratings. Her courtroom presence, her refusal to engage in emotional warfare, her use of process instead of personality, it all became part of something bigger. The trial had ended, but the conversation had only just begun. She hadn't destroyed a show. She hadn't canceled anyone. She had simply said no, and then proven, in front of the nation, that truth can still bring the powerful to their knees. For Jasmine, vindication didn't come from a headline. It came from something far rarer, justice in plain sight. And while others were still scrambling to reframe the narrative, she had already moved on. The empire had cracked. The apology had aired. The verdict had been read. And the world, it had heard her, clearly, without shouting, without scandal, just a suitcase full of evidence, a courtroom full of truth, and a nation forced for once to sit down, shut up, and listen. And while Jasmine Crockett walked quietly out of the courthouse, no entourage, no press conference, no victory lap, the shockwave she left behind rippled like a detonation through the entire broadcast industry. Her silence did not mute the moment, it magnified it. Within hours of the ruling, not just ABC, but every major network across the country entered crisis mode. Executives flooded production group chats, emergency Slack channels lit up, and legal departments were summoned like firefighters to a multi-alarm blaze. A dozen showrunners across New York and Los Angeles issued urgent memos to their on-air hosts. Effective immediately, all talent must review recent commentary and flag any segment involving political figures, legal disputes, or personal mockery for legal vetting. What Jasmine had done wasn't just win, it was redefine the battlefield. In one courtroom, with one verdict, she had shifted the gravity of risk. Within 24 hours, a prominent cable news channel canceled 3 of its upcoming segments labeled as explosive debates, fearing that lines blurred too close to actionable defamation. One segment, originally titled Dragging the Radicals Live, was quietly pulled from the programming lineup, its promo material scrubbed before sunrise. A producer at that network, speaking off the record, admitted bluntly, "It's not just about The View anymore. Now every mic is a potential liability." Legal firms across the country moved swiftly to capitalize. Several top-tier media law practices began drafting new compliance workshops under an urgent banner, satire or smear, navigating speech liability in the era of live broadcasting. The subtitle, What Crockett vs. ABC Teaches Us All. Registrations surged. By the end of the week, law firms from DC to Beverly Hills were offering masterclasses to news producers, podcast creators, and public figures alike. Classes that didn't exist 2 weeks ago. One senior attorney tweeted, 10 years of case law just got rewritten by one woman with a locked suitcase of receipts. And behind studio curtains, the fear was visceral. A prominent talk show host, someone who had sat comfortably in prime time for nearly 2 decades, spoke to the New York Times under condition of anonymity. His voice, usually thunderous on air, now sounded cautious. "If even Whoopi can go down," he said, "then no one's untouchable anymore." That verdict didn't just hit them, it hit all of us. Hard. The line ran the next morning in bold italics beneath a stark headline, "TV's age of immunity is over." For years, media personalities believed in a kind of cultural diplomatic immunity, where apology absolved harm, where ratings insulated ethics. Jasmine had proved otherwise. Back at ABC headquarters, the fallout had turned inward. In a 4-hour closed-door internal summit, dozens of producers, executives, and legal officers gathered to dissect the trial not as a court loss, but as a corporate catastrophe. The atmosphere was clinical, brutal, and ice cold. No jokes, no justifications. Every voice was recorded. At one point, a senior vice president, normally calm, now visibly shaken, stood and addressed the room. "Let's stop blaming Crockett." She didn't outmaneuver us with emotions. We lost because we ignored warning after warning. We lost because we thought no one would dare challenge us. And then we kept poking, and she didn't flinch. She filed then, leaning into the microphone. He delivered the final cut. "We weren't beaten by a lawsuit. We shot ourselves in the foot with arrogance, and we bled out on national television." That quote leaked within minutes. Screenshots of internal emails circulated on Reddit, Discord servers, and insider journalism forums. A draft of ABC's damage control strategy titled Post-Crockett Protocol went viral overnight. It included new restrictions on improvisational banter during live shows, mandatory legal reviews for hot topic episodes, and a temporary freeze on booking political guests altogether. ABC wasn't just recovering, they were rebuilding from rubble. PR firms were dispatched like trauma surgeons. Investor calls were flooded with questions. Would stockholders sue? Would advertisers return? Would The View ever air again? And yet, through all of it, through the sudden industry-wide humility, through the revised scripts and broken egos, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. The networks filled their hours with analysis. Experts took to podcasts, calling it the trial that tamed the beast. But Jasmine didn't need to respond. She had already spoken, in affidavits, in transcripts, in airtight evidence. She had spoken without shouting, without venom, without spectacle. And what made her victory so final, so cutting, was that she never asked for revenge. She asked for respect. And the court demanded it for her. Now, as morning shows shuffled nervously through their cue cards, every segment was weighed differently. Could that joke be misread? Could that segment become a subpoena? The cameras still rolled. The sets still gleamed. But the tone had shifted. The air was cautious now, almost reverent. And for the first time in years, power no longer belonged to the one with the biggest audience or the boldest insult. It belonged to the one who brought truth to court and walked out undefeated. And as the last of the shattered broadcast giants limped from the wreckage of the verdict, the center of gravity shifted, not just in media, but in culture. What began as a legal confrontation became a watershed moment for accountability in the public square. Jasmine Crockett's name no longer belonged solely to a courtroom or a congressional district. It became a fixture in the American lexicon, a shorthand for principled resistance, for calm under fire, for fighting back not with fury, but with fact. In the weeks that followed, she wasn't just cited. She was studied, invoked, and ultimately elevated. Every major law school in the country scrambled to update its fall curriculum. Georgetown, Columbia, Stanford, each announced a dedicated seminar on Crockett vs. ABC before the ink on the verdict had even dried. Invitations poured in. She was asked to keynote at legal ethics symposiums, to testify before Senate committees on speech and liability, to appear on panel after panel dissecting her case as a landmark in First Amendment boundaries. And while she accepted a few carefully chosen forms rooted in jurisprudence and public integrity, she turned down every entertainment invitation without hesitation. No late-night interviews, no book deals, no Netflix dramatizations. Jasmine's silence wasn't retreat, it was strategy, and it only made her victory echo louder. Time magazine didn't ask for a quote. They didn't need one. Instead, they published a stark, defiant cover. Black background, white serif text, and her face. Expressionless, steady, lit from one side like a courtroom statue. The headline read, "The Quiet Fire, Jasmine Crockett and the Day TV Learned Fear." The feature inside was not breathless hero worship. It was an autopsy of an industry, dissecting how arrogance, negligence, and hubris fell to patience, discipline, and documentation. The article's final paragraph read like a judgment carved into marble. In an era defined by outrage, she chose restraint. In a medium ruled by spectacle, she chose truth. And in a world that expected her to scream, Jasmine Crockett simply built her case and watched the empire collapse under its own weight. But the reverberations reached far beyond magazine pages and lecture halls. In Washington, Capitol Hill took note. The House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution announced an emergency hearing on media accountability, citing the Crockett case as a national teaching moment. A bipartisan coalition, something almost extinct in modern politics, called for new legislative reviews into the boundaries of defamation, retaliation, and ethical responsibility for televised commentary. During the opening session, Jasmine's trial footage was played in part as a cautionary tale, in part as legal precedent. One congressman, usually hostile to progressive causes, paused midway through his questioning to admit, "Whether you agree with her politics or not, what Crockett just did changed the rules." Period. On social media, the symbol of Jasmine transformed. Artists painted murals in D.C., Chicago, and Oakland, depicting her not with a megaphone, but with a briefcase and courtroom transcript in hand. Memes turned her into a folk legend, the attorney who never shouted, never folded, and never missed. Protesters outside media headquarters in Los Angeles began carrying signs that read, "Bring facts like Crockett," and "Not every war needs a shout." Journalists in training began referring to poorly sourced segments as Crockett bait, a quiet industry term meaning, "You'd better hope she doesn't see this." And still, Jasmine said almost nothing. She issued no manifesto. She published no open letter. But behind the silence was a growing impact that no microphone could manufacture. At Harvard Law School, Professor Marian Lasker, a legal scholar with 3 decades of Supreme Court analysis under her belt, was asked during a televised forum, "What made Jasmine Crockett different?" She didn't hesitate. She didn't win with emotion. She won with disciplined patience. The very thing television was never prepared to confront. Crockett weaponized credibility, and it terrified them. The clip went viral overnight. Meanwhile, media corporations rewrote their training materials. Major talk shows instituted 5-second delays on live tapings. Legal consultants were embedded into production rooms. It became normal to hear producers say things like, "Run it through a Crockett screen," before greenlighting any political content. ABC, still reeling from internal hemorrhaging, quietly settled 3 other lawsuits that had been looming in the shadows, eager to avoid any more public courtroom disasters. Crockett had become the new threshold. If your segment couldn't survive her standard, it didn't air. And yet, for all the frenzy, for all the national retooling and institutional repentance, Jasmine remained unfazed. In an age where victory is often accompanied by spectacle, balloons, book launches, triumphant sound bites, she refused to let the world repackage her into clickbait. Her most public post-verdict moment was an unannounced visit to a community legal aid center in Baltimore, where she delivered boxes of courtroom resources, annotated transcripts, and legal templates for underserved clients. No press, no camera crew, just an aide, 2 paralegals, and a stack of justice hard-earned. And that, more than any magazine cover, any viral quote, any panel discussion, is what cemented her place in history. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a lawsuit. She rewrote the rules of public confrontation. She proved that truth, when armed with discipline and backed by law, is not just powerful, it's indestructible. The media had mocked her, provoked her, underestimated her. But when the time came, she didn't fight fire with fire. She fought with paper, tape, transcripts, timelines, and the quiet confidence of someone who never doubted what was right. Now every newsroom has a new baseline. Every anchor has a new caution. Every executive has a new fear. And every law student has a new case to study, not just for its outcome, but for the impossible precision with which it was waged. Jasmine Crockett didn't just walk into a courtroom. She walked into an industry's blind spot and turned it into a mirror. And the reflection it cast was unmistakably hers. And even after the courtroom had emptied, the lights dimmed, and the networks rewrote their policies, the resonance of Jasmine Crockett's battle continued to ripple, quietly, powerfully, and relentlessly. It did not end with applause. It did not climax with a victory parade or self-congratulatory speech. It ended with a shift in how an entire nation viewed speech, power, and responsibility. The finality wasn't in celebration, it was in reflection. Across classrooms, newsrooms, and courtrooms, something had changed. The once unquestioned sanctity of political satire and televised sarcasm had been split open, and what emerged was not censorship, but accountability. What Jasmine had achieved without shouting, without theatrics, wasn't just justice, it was a reset. In the weeks that followed, the cultural shift hardened into an awakening. College campuses launched nationwide discussions on the limits of satire and the ethics of public commentary. At USC's School of Cinematic Arts, a panel titled Laughter, Libel, and the Line drew an audience that spilled into hallways. Ivy League classrooms updated lecture slides with Crockett's testimony as the new defining precedent for retaliation in media. What used to be shrugged off as just a joke was now dissected with legal scrutiny. Students, professors, and media theorists began to reframe the very premise of harmless humor. And beneath it all, an urgent question began echoing through digital headlines and think pieces. When does a punchline become a weapon? The shift was not just academic, it was emotional. Survivors of online smear campaigns, whistleblowers mocked in the press, and private citizens ridiculed by viral moments now found in Jasmine a silent champion. She had turned humiliation into litigation, and she had won. Her case, once dismissed by skeptics as career suicide, had become the North Star for anyone silenced by spectacle. Across social media, thousands began sharing the phrase now immortalized by her courtroom demeanor. Don't scream, don't shrink, document. But the crescendo came not in a courtroom or on a cable segment, but at the Global Media Ethics Conference in Geneva, a gathering of the world's most decorated journalists, broadcasters, and legal analysts, each eager to reframe what responsibility meant in the age of virality. On the third day of the summit, in the marble-lined auditorium of Palais des Nations, a media scholar from the University of Copenhagen took the podium. She carried no slides, no video, just a printout of a quote that had begun to circle the world like a signal fire. With a pause, she read aloud, "When a show mocks you, look straight into the camera. When they clip it and post it, take them to court." The auditorium went silent, and in that stillness, something profound took hold. The words weren't defiant. They were clear, not vengeance, not anger, just a statement of line, of consequence, of earned reckoning. The quote spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it was printed on protest signs, painted on murals in Brooklyn, screen printed on tote bags at Columbia Law. On X, formerly Twitter, it became a viral header image with millions of shares. The phrase did not preach revolution, it demanded dignity. For decades, the line between comedy and cruelty had been blurry by design. Now, thanks to one woman's methodical refusal to be reduced to a punchline, that line had definition. Late-night writers, once untouchable in their sarcasm, now consulted in-house attorneys before targeting political figures. Media watchdogs expanded their scope from newsrooms to entertainment studios. Suddenly, shows that had long prided themselves on their edgy irreverence found themselves revisiting old footage with panic and regret. It wasn't censorship, it was consequences. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett did not gloat. She made no victory lap. Her public appearances remained limited and deliberate. Law symposiums, congressional hearings, and civic education forums. When approached for book deals, she declined. When invited to reappear on major networks, some even offering special apology town halls, she simply replied, "My work speaks for itself. I don't need a stage. I had a courtroom." In private legal circles, she became the subject of hushed admiration. Senior partners began citing her case as a model of how to win without spectacle. Law professors praised her courtroom demeanor as evidence incarnate. And in the minds of the public, Jasmine's image morphed into something rare and enduring. Not a celebrity, but a standard. The kind you measure policy against. The kind you invoke when telling someone to stand their ground. For journalists with integrity, she became a moral compass. For entertainers who once blurred fact and fiction, she became a cautionary tale. And for citizens everywhere who had been mocked, discredited, or ridiculed in the name of ratings, she became proof that the law still had teeth and the truth still had power. And so, the story ended not with cheers, but with change. Not with fireworks, but with guidelines. Not with noise, but with silence. Firm, principled silence. The media no longer laughed quite so carelessly. The public no longer watched quite so passively. And the law, once considered too slow to catch up with the pace of broadcast slander, had finally caught up, and then raced ahead. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., long after the headlines had cooled and the cameras pointed elsewhere, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, finalizing new language for a bill to expand protections for victims of retaliatory media attacks. She signed it with a pen gifted by a young law student who had skipped graduation just to attend her trial. The pen was engraved with a single phrase: "Not every truth needs a microphone. Some just need a record." And in that quiet, deliberate motion, Jasmine Crockett didn't just close a chapter. She started a movement. As the echo of Jasmine Crockett's victory settled across courtrooms, newsrooms, and legislative halls, something even more profound began to unfold beneath the surface. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was irreversible. The media industry, long addicted to provocation and protected by parody, began to shiver under the weight of its own reflection. The networks that once turned conflict into currency now found themselves re-examining every segment, every monologue, every supposed zinger. The lawsuits weren't flying yet, but the fear was real. In writers' rooms from Manhattan to Hollywood, producers scribbled furiously on whiteboards under new mandates: fact-check jokes, tone down sarcasm, run legal review first. It was no longer enough to be clever. Now they had to be correct. What Jasmine sparked wasn't a crackdown. It was a recalibration. Showrunners held emergency summits on defamation risk mitigation, a phrase that had once been relegated to the bottom of email chains. Satirical late-night programs that once thrived on ridicule began consulting with legal counsel before final cuts. Segments titled Clown of the Week or Mock the Madness were either rebranded or retired entirely. Networks weren't just afraid of another lawsuit, they were afraid of another Jasmine. A woman who didn't scream, didn't flinch, and didn't fold. A woman who used the very rules the industry ignored to write a verdict that would live longer than any punchline. In editorial meetings at major publications, editors reminded their columnists, "We're not above the law. The court just reminded us of that." Even podcast hosts, the new frontier of unfettered speech, issued internal memos to their teams clarifying the boundaries between opinion, humor, and actionable harm. The ripple effect wasn't just legal, it was moral. And at the center of it stood Jasmine Crockett, not seeking revenge, but reminding a country that had confused cruelty with commentary that the microphone is not a shield. It's a responsibility. And yet, even in her silence, Jasmine was everywhere. Her case became a reference in journalism schools, a citation in legal briefs, a conversation starter in corporate boardrooms. Talk show panels began referencing her name with hesitation, almost reverence. Lawmakers quoted her strategy during hearings about reforming speech protections. She had become what no satirical host had ever predicted, a legal landmark in human form. And still, she gave no speeches, no interviews, no memoirs, just presence. And its weight was undeniable. And then came the moment the cameras had been waiting for. Outside the courthouse, as the media assembled in force, a corridor of flashing bulbs and whirring lenses stretched like a canyon of judgment. Journalists elbowed for position. Commentators rehearsed their questions. But Jasmine Crockett emerged not as a triumphant celebrity, nor as a vengeful victor. She emerged as a reckoning. She stepped onto the granite steps of the courthouse with slow precision, flanked not by bodyguards but by silence. No smile, no wave, no victory sign. Just a locked expression of control, a message, not a moment. Dozens of reporters shouted questions. None were answered. Instead, she paused halfway down the steps, facing the sea of cameras. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't clear her throat. She simply looked. A stillness that pierced through static, a gaze that said everything a press release never could. And then, as the bulbs flickered and the mics trembled, she uttered the only sentence she had prepared. Not rehearsed, not market-tested, just lived. I didn't come here to be famous. I came to remind them, when words are sharp enough, they cut like actions, and should cost just as much. She turned, walked. No handlers, no music swell. The echo of her heels on the stone steps cut sharper than any verdict. And just like that, the image was immortalized. Jasmine Crockett, back turned to power, walking away from fame and toward the next fight the world didn't yet know it needed. The story didn't end there. It didn't need to. The world had already taken its note, and the cameras kept rolling. But this time, they listened. But as the cameras faded and the world moved on to its next scandal, what remained wasn't just legal precedent, it was a moral bruise on the conscience of a nation. This wasn't about celebrity or ratings anymore. It was about the line between power and cruelty, and what happens when someone finally dares to draw it. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a courtroom war. She reminded America of something it had forgotten in its hunger for spectacle. That human dignity is not collateral for laughs. That silence, when rooted in truth, can speak louder than any monologue. That no title, comedian, anchor, or executive, justifies mockery disguised as commentary. She showed the world that accountability doesn't need a spotlight to be devastating. It only needs patience. And when injustice becomes routine, discipline becomes the sharpest weapon. In the end, Jasmine taught us all, justice isn't about crushing the loudest voice. It's about protecting the quiet ones who dare to stand. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.